Okay, hello everyone. Can everyone hear us at the back? Yes? Perfect. So welcome everyone to the Cambridge Union. We have the pleasure of being joined by Ahmed Keeler. Before we start, I'd just like to introduce him. Ahmed Paul Keeler is a visiting fellow at the Centre of Islamic Studies here at the University of Cambridge. Born and raised as a conservative Christian, it was through a series of life-changing encounters that led to his embracing of Islam. He was the founder and director of the World of Islam Festival in 1976, which was inaugurated by Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. Following its success, he has continued to engage with projects relating to Islamic civilization, traditional culture, and the environment. Since 2014, he has been pioneering the Mizan thesis, which has culminated in 2 publications, Rethinking Islam and his most recent work, A Life's Journey. I'd like to welcome you with the Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So I guess just to start off, you have an absolutely incredible life. Please take us on a journey from the start.
Gosh. I have to first apologize because I'm just, as I'm sure many of you are, recovering from a cold, which unfortunately went onto my chest. And up until yesterday, I wasn't very sure whether I'd be able to make it or not. But I woke up this morning with the intention that I would do my very best to come. So I hope you'll be able to hear me. Can you hear me at the back? Everybody can hear me? That's fine. So really, whenever I begin a talk, I have the wonderful opportunity of discussing and enjoying and sharing with, especially with people of your generation. I always begin by not knowing what I'm going to say. Why? I suppose to sort of put me into a state of fear, of terror at that blank sheet. I don't know why, but I've always done it. And it always has worked quite well. Because I'm a great believer that it is the chemistry between the person who's come to talk and the people who are there and have made the effort and have arrived to come and listen. And I am going to be drawing inspiration from you. Because I suppose my first survey is that you are all like my children. I was 80 a few months ago. I was born in 1942. I grew up in the British Empire. I grew up in a world in which, from the privileged members of society, I was educated for empire. I was educated to become a functionary of the British Empire. What did that education mean? Because I was the last generation to have that full education. I went to my prep school at the age of 8, boarding, in 1950. And I spent my next 10 years in boarding school until the age of 18. And that education, I can tell you, was something unbelievable. It had been worked out in the 19th century when the British Empire was straddling the world. And they needed people who could go out and run an empire who were completely loyal to the state And in order to do that, they looked at the Spartan system of education. That when you take a child from the family at the age of 8, you remove them into their own peer group, and you have them for 10 years, you can turn them into servants of the state. And the public school system during the 19th century was developed in order to produce that elite that could go anywhere in the world, to darkest Africa, to the savage places. I'm talking as an empire man. To the benighted world of India, to go and to civilize, to Christianize, and to enlighten. That was the mission. And we were taught to believe absolutely in the absolute preeminence of the English. Probably the British as well, but I was in the heartland of England. And that education was a very, very harsh education. The discipline was horrendous. Little boys of 8, terrible beatings, rules which you had to absolutely go by. We were taught about the heroes of England, Alfred and the Capes, Alfred the Great, the Sir Walter Raleigh with when he put his cape so that Queen Elizabeth's feet wouldn't get wet in the puddle. The death of Lord Nelson. Marlborough's great battles. The Duke of Wellington and his conquests. We were taught the history of England in terms of the great conquerors. And of course, we'd just come out of the war. And all the films after the war that went on replaying the war. The Sea Shall Not Have Them, Reach for the Sky, all these war films in which it showed how the amazing British airmen, seamen, and soldiers had won the war. The Americans came in late as usual, but it was these British heroes. We knew nothing of the Russian front. I had to reach adulthood before I knew anything about the Russian front. It was a purely British, English achievement. India. The only thing I remember being taught about India was the Black Hole of Calcutta. I don't know whether any of you know about this, but this is a great moment when English women and children and men were put into this prison area. And they forgot about them and they all died, and it was a huge, huge scandal. India was the white man's burden. This was the education. So by the age of 11 or 12, we believed, just as the British had believed for a very long time, that the English were the greatest civilization that the world had ever known. Can you imagine? And that education hadn't changed. We learned Latin, obviously. We knew all about Caesar, the great Julius Caesar. And we were also being brought up as devout Christians. So on the one hand you had Jesus Christ, and on the other hand you had Julius Caesar. It was only a long time, much later, that one began to see the contradiction between these two great figures. There's only one big problem, and that was that when I arrived at the age of 18, I'd been fully educated in this great empire education. There was no empire. The empire was being dismantled. I was out of a job. Fundamentally, I was good for nothing. Because academically, I had absolutely no interest. I had never been inspired by the teachers. The only thing that had galvanized me was at the age of 14, when I arrived from my prep school to my public school, which was Lancing College. They had an audition for a play, and the play was Hamlet by William Shakespeare. And I went in for the audition, and I got the part of Ophelia. Now, as you probably all know, in those days there were boarding schools for boys. And like in the time of Shakespeare, the younger boys played the girls' parts. And this was the great opening of my life, because I was completely taken by this play and the whole drama of it. And by the time the play was put on, I knew it by heart. And from that moment on, theatre became my life. And at Lancing, we went through one wonderful plays. We did The Firstborn by Christopher Fry. We did the Doctor's Dilemma by Bernard Shaw. And we ended by doing Marlowe's Faustus, and I played the part of Dr. Faustus. It was in the garden, beautiful summer's evening. At that moment when Faustus is crying out to heaven, begging that he could repent, but he'd sold his soul to the devil, and there was no repentance. And the moon was out, and it was a very magical setting. But I was extremely fortunate at Lancing, because I engaged with the two great modern plays. Hamlet, when you get the introduction of the human being when he becomes confused, when the whole religious edifice has been shaken to its core with the Reformation, and where he's standing between two worlds, the Christian world and this new mercantile warrior, rather strange world of the Renaissance that was emerging. And Shakespeare catches that bewilderment, that deep-seated feeling that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And that magical play takes place. Dr. Faustus is a much easier play to understand. Because Dr. Faustus is the story of how the intelligent man, the man whose mind is full of curiosity, who wants to discover everything, who wants to know about everything, who wants to experience every sensation that is possible to man. And in order to do it, he makes a pact with Satan. And Satan provides him with the power to be able to experience everything, to delve into the very bowels of the earth and extract from it every delight, every sensation, every magical event that is possible. But time continues on. And finally, his agreement has an end date. And the end date is when finally he is called away, out. And what is the value of everything he has experienced? Of having plundered the earth, of having brought things from every part of the earth. He wanted to eat pomegranates in London or in Oxford. And they were brought to him by the jinn. Anything he ordered came to his plate. Any desire he wanted to kiss Helen of Troy. And she was brought to him. And he was able to kiss her. Can you imagine? So, by the age of 18, I was really good for nothing other than the theatre. And then I went through 10 years, which were quite extraordinary. I arrived in London at the Central School of Speech and Drama in 1960, the beginning of the decade of the Cultural Revolution, of the moments when there was a huge eruption and rebellion against the status quo, against the privileged, against the idea of England, against the idea of empire. This was all happening in the 60s. This is when it took place. This is the moment when in every field there was this eruption. And it so happened that by some extraordinary thing, there were 2 drama schools in London at the time. There was the Royal Academy and there was the Central School of Speech and Drama. The Royal Academy was a traditional school. It was still teaching Shakespeare. It was very much on the traditional Terence Rattick and all the... And if I had gone there, I don't think I'd be sitting here talking to you today. I would have been an actor. But I went to the Central School. And the Central School had just been connected to the Royal Court. And the Royal Court in London was the hotbed where the new drama was taking place. The first, which had broken the mold, was Look Back in Anger by John Osborne. And that had just done the rounds and come back into London. And our drama school had been taken over by the Royal Court people, and I had 3 years of angst. 3 years of being exposed to those dramas, to those authors, to those playwrights who were tearing down the world that I'd been born in. tearing down the church, tearing down the establishment, tearing down the world of business, the world of Pinter, the world of Wesker, what we used to call the kitchen sink dramas, constant angst, the breakdown of relationships, the non-communication, the conflict between classes. It was fantastic for a little boy from Windsor who'd been brought up in the establishment. And I soaked all this in, because suddenly we were seeing the world from a completely different perspective. Suddenly we were, things like, for example, when the Battle for Algiers, have you seen the Battle for Algiers? Have you seen this film, The Battle for Algiers? Anybody? You've seen it? You know what it is. You understand it. This film, you should see. It came out in 1962, a couple of years after the fall of the liberation of Algeria. It is an amazing film. And suddenly we were seeing the world from the other perspective. No longer us looking at the world from our perspective, which was complete and total. Looking out at the world as a place to be civilized by us. We're beginning to see that these people are not subhuman. For the Englishman, the subhuman began with the French. France was a dirty place for us. Goodness knows what it was like when we got to Africa and to India. But now, we were seeing it from the other perspective. And we were rebels. We were trying to reorientate ourselves, to rediscover. And it's a terrible thing when you have to break away from the world that has brought you up. But after 3 years, although it was very stimulating, my interest in acting had evaporated. Something of the magic of theatre had simply disappeared. Shakespeare, Marlowe, sure, something was in these works which took you. But too much Pinter, too much Brecht, too much of these. My spirit was becoming dulled. And then I met an artist. And I spent the next 3 years, 4 years, maybe 5 years, in the world of modern art. My father had shops in London, optical shops. And he had one which is a 4-story building on the corner of Wimpole Street and Wigmore Street. And I convinced him to let me have it so that I could open an art gallery. And I opened this gallery of kinetic art. That's art which moves, which produces visual experiences. And it so happened that many of the artists I represented, they lived in Paris, but they came from Venezuela, Brazil, the South American world. They were Iberian. And they were deeply inspired by the art of Granada, the Islamic pattern, the geometric patterns of the Alhambra. This inspired them because they were visually, they could do things visually with them. They were optical, they could create optical illusions of things. So I came to know a little bit about Moorish Spain. My gallery is now very famous. Tate Modern has a whole section. The artists are famed in that world. And I was deeply engaged in that world. I put on the exhibitions, I used to travel to the places, go to the Biennales, go to Venice. I was engaged with the artists. I loved the experience of watching these creative people produce these crazy things. And then one day my father looked at the money that was pouring out. He was shocked. And he put a stopper to it. And the gallery had to close. I had to sell the collection that I was making. I was devastated. My life seems to have come to an end. I was 26 years old and I thought this was the end of my existence. And it so happened that this coincided with 1968. And from America, with the Vietnam War, there was the great rebellion that was taking place, and there was the total and complete rejection by this time of the existing order. And I found my house, because the only thing I had left was my house, 4-story house on the outskirts of Islington. Suddenly it was filling up. And I ended up with a house full of poets, dancers, painters, a group, a commune called the Exploding Galaxy. And we would go around London, putting on shows, happenings, living a life completely separate from the society. The world of the hippies. The world of all you need is love. Great anthem of the Beatles. A world in which the young wish to completely change everything. And as I look back on it, a kind of Christian revival without Christianity. But what it was seeking was a spirituality that had been lost. And India became the great ideal. And America, the America of the Indians. We used to call them Red Indians in those days. Now the Native Indians, the Native Americans. And their lives, their spirituality became what interested us, what inspired us, what we longed for, something. We're getting very close to the end. Because at this moment was the moment when the great moment of my life came about. And the lady who became my wife, because we went into this together. We were expecting, because India for us was a Hindu world, we knew nothing about Islam. And we were invited to this concert of North Indian classical music. It was a private concert. And we met this amazing traditional master musician from Delhi. And the immersion in that music and in that man's being took me from understanding the shallow, egocentric nightmare of modern art to that of the glorious humility, beauty, and maturity of the traditional art and of the traditional artist. And I wanted to know about his background. So I organized a small festival of the arts of Mughal India, because his music was that of the courts of North India, going right back to the Delhi Sultanate, to Amir Khusro. And then I had a great inspiration, which was that he has been introducing me to Muslim India. And I knew something of Moorish Spain because of the artists of my gallery. And I realized that there's nothing that connected these two worlds other than Islam. And they were one culture. They were one world. The art forms were the same. The principles were the same. The law was the same. This extraordinary world that spread from Spain to India and beyond. The only thing that connected it was this Islam. So I then spent the next 7 years organizing the largest event that has ever taken place in London. 12 museum exhibitions, 6 films for the television, over 100 lectures, 22 seminars, more than 50 books published. The World of Islam Festival of 76. And this was my education. Because in the process of organizing it, I was in touch with all the scholars. I was in touch with the artists. We had all the musicians from literally from Morocco through to India. By the end of it, I was absorbed in the culture to the extent that it was my life. And 6 months before the festival, I didn't want to end up like Lawrence of Arabia, schizophrenic. I wanted to be home. And I entered Islam. And people ask me, what brought you to Islam? My answer is music, friendship, and food. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keeler, for that remarkable insight into your life so far. I'll pose a few questions for yourself before I move on to the floor. You've already answered my first question, really, about how you found Islam through music, food, and friendship. But I guess you touch on your experience as a child of empire in a post-Pax Britannica world where empire was status quo. What was your sort of perception of this global south, of this global other, in such time dominated by imperial narratives?
What, as a child?
During your experience growing up, yes.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I suppose growing up, the two great events which dominated us was the First World War and the Second World War. So that was and we saw it. We were educated in terms of it as being very European experience for us. When I was at prep school from the age of 8 to 14, every Sunday we had a collection for some cause. And it was usually a mission in Africa, some village in Africa or in India. So my perception of the world, and you got this through the Geographical magazine, and people used to talk about savages. I mean, that was in the natural language. So one perceived the world out there as being one which was benefiting hugely from our empire. I mean, it's really difficult, unless you actually experienced it, to know what it means to be, well, we all know what it means because we're all inside worlds. But the British Empire was quite something in terms of its confidence. And I wasn't from that class at the highest level where you go to Eton or you go to Harrow and there's a certain cynicism. I was of that class which was very, very sincere. So the world out there was a world that required to be, the modernizing hadn't really developed so much. It was much more to do with the civilizing and the Christian. Because as you probably know from my book, I've understood the West as being not one world, but three completely distinct worlds. The Christian, the civilized, which is the world created by the Renaissance, and the modern. And they are totally separate worlds, coexisting, but in continuous conflict. The Christian and the modern have they are diametrically opposite. The civilized, which is the world of the warriors, the world of the statues, wherever you go, you see these, the great warrior people, statesmen. In other words, the world of Caesar, Augustus Caesar. And then you have the modern. And you only have to go around Cambridge to see the buildings. You have the Christian buildings like King's Chapel, next to it the Gibbs, which is a classical horizontal building, and then the modern. They're totally different principles. Separate education, separate art. These are different worlds. And in the West, we live in this kind of, not schizophrenic, but what's the three one? We have three worlds we inhabit. The Muslim only has two, Islam and the modern. Totally separate worlds. So this in a sense is the key that has come out of, it's the foundation of the whole Mizan thesis. Which if you want to know more about, just read my books. Or come to the Mizan study circle. We're on Zoom now.
I think that goes on to, I guess...
Sorry, I had to put in that verse.
No problem, we can share that later as well. I guess to follow on, you mentioned, of course, your book, Rethinking Islam in the West. How did you go about challenging the narratives about modernity and Islam, especially during a turning point in the 20th century that sort of saw both as incompatible, when you were sort of pioneering a new narrative in terms of understanding both the Western world and Islam?
I think one of the things which happened when I became a Muslim was that I had been born into a very certain world. And I liked that certainty, that sense of belonging to something that is whole. And then that had completely been fractured during the 60s. When I entered Islam, I saw, the thing that I saw was the unity, the wholeness, the completeness of that world. And this was wonderful. But there was a huge dissonance between Islam as a religion and the Muslim conception or understanding of Islam in history. And the more I pondered and reflected this, I realized that the view of history was that which had been given to them from the Western perspective. First of all, the humanist, and then the modern perspective. The fundamentalist Muslims consider that the minute Islam stepped out of Arabia and you had the Umayyads, everything goes to pot. Others believe that in the 19th century Orientalist idea that Islam had a golden age. And after that golden age, Islam declined and the West took off. And the Muslims' job is now to catch up. In other words, we live in a world of development and underdevelopment. This made no sense to me. I could not believe the idea that you had the final revelation from Almighty Allah in all its perfection, transmitted to the final prophet of Almighty God. The perfection of prophethood, who in 23 years, it took 23 years for this final revelation to be transmitted to the companions. And at the end of that, our beloved prophet said, "Have I done it? Have I finished? Is it? This is it. It's done." And then the idea that that could then go up like a little rocket into some sort of golden age and then plummet down into the earth. Mamma mia, what a ridiculous idea. What an absurdity. What a complete nonsense. Because what I had seen in the art was a world that was so extraordinary, so beautiful, so manifesting peace, and so manifesting mizan. And it was the discovery of that, or the realization of that, that made me realize that that mizan had to be manifested in every aspect of Dar al-Islam. And when Ibn Battuta departed from Morocco, he traveled across 44 modern countries to China. And everywhere he went, he could practice his profession as a scholar and judge. From Morocco to China, he could speak with the intellectuals in Arabic. He passed through every language, every race in existence on his journeys, and he was at home. He never left home. How could you create a humanity that was unified in a civilization that spread from West Africa through to China? Unbelievable. And we cannot see it because we are blinded by a Western horizontal view of history. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Seljukids, the Ottomans, the Mongols, a historical, political history. You see, Islam went beyond politics. The Roman Empire, when the political structure collapsed, the whole civilization collapsed. When the Chinese dynasty failed, China went into chaos until the new dynasty was established. In Europe, we are politically held together, but Islam was not. Islam went way beyond the political. Hundreds of dynasties came and went, but Dar al-Islam continued. It produced a world that went beyond the warriors, through the pious merchant. And the pious merchant is a phenomenon. So this world of Islam has become my passion to be able to understand it. Because once we understand it, we will realize that Islam did not fail as a world, but it succeeded as it should have done. It became what it had to become. In every aspect, it reached that perfection of Mizan, in terms of its Sharia, in terms of its arts, in terms of its intellect, in terms of its political governance. The system is amazing and the manifestation of Mizan. When you then turn the light of Mizan upon the modern, it becomes very clear. The modern broke the balance. It broke the balance with nature. It broke the relationship with the divine. And we are now experiencing the age of crises. The age as multiple crises grow exponentially. As Muslims, alhamdulillah, we have our refuge. Islam is the same as it has always been. It began in Mecca, surrounded by the Jahiliyyah. And Mecca, the period of the 10 years of the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, is the most sublime period in the whole story of Dar al-Islam. We are now living in a time of deep crisis for all humanity. But inside that crisis all over the world, there are the still centers of Islam. Those multiple Meccas all over the world, in which that relationship with the Almighty, that centeredness, that complete and absolute confidence in the divine is secure. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.
Thank you.
I don't know if this answers your question or not.
Yes, it definitely does in many ways. I do want to pass on to the audience before we do run out of time. So if you have any questions, yes, from yourself.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned Ibn Battuta and how he was able to travel around the whole of the old continent, being able to speak Arabic with people and understanding where he went. I saw a parallel with what we have now in terms of the Anglo-American cultural hegemony. The empire of armies is collapsed, but everywhere you go in India, in Africa, you'll find KFC and McDonald's. What do you make of, and it goes deeper as well, what do you make of the cultural hegemon that we have now of globally?
The important thing is what they're saying. What are people talking? What's coming out of the mouths?
English?
We're living in a world of fragmentation. Modernity reached its great centralizing power. It's now produced the technologies for total fragmentation. We live in a Twitter world. We live in a world of very little coherence. very little coherence. So the English language is being murdered all over the world. And no more than in here, in this country. The capacity for coherence is disappearing. So I can't see any parallel to the world of Islam, which was a world of coherence, and a world in which those who spoke Arabic were men of great erudition and learning and piety. And the combination of erudition and piety is quite a mixture. So I was talking about the pious merchant. This is an extraordinary thing. The merchant is the most materialistic of people. They're dealing with the material world. And yet in Islam they became men of great spirituality and carried Islam. It is amazing. The world of Islam has to be rediscovered by your generation, because the world as it is now is a world that is unlike anything that has ever existed before. And it's a dysfunctional, aberrational world. And you have been brought up. Your grandparents, the people who came to this country, they were great heroes in my book. It was amazing what they did. And I see so many beautiful faces of the young Muslims of this generation. And alhamdulillah, I believe that the role you have is so important, because the world is breaking apart. It's culturally disintegrating. But for us Muslims, our religion is intact. Alhamdulillah.
Okay, so we'll take a few more questions. Yes, from the front.
Could I ask, is the idea of Christendom in any way comparable to Islam in terms of this being this kind of unified whole, or are they? Would you say they're two different concepts, especially within the history?
Sorry, can you speak up?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask: is the idea of Christendom comparable in any way with Islam in terms of being a unified whole?
Yeah.
Or do you say that they're two different ideas?
Very interesting question, and a very important question. Christendom inhabited the Roman Empire. That was Christendom. And it was broken into two parts, because the Roman Empire was in two parts. It was in the Latin part and the Greek part. So you had the church splitting between the Orthodox and the Catholic, the Latin, the Greek. And Christendom as a world never went beyond the Roman Empire. Little pockets, but not Christendom. And Christendom was continually in problems over its doctrine. The whole concept of the Trinity was a big problem. The business of the divinity of Almighty of Jesus Christ was a big problem. And you had, for the first 300 or 400 years of the Christian period, you had all the different sects that came out with different ideas about whether he was wholly human or whole, part human, etc., etc., etc. And then Christendom split up with the Reformation between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant in a terrible violence. There is no comparison between Islam and the Christendom in terms of the scale, in terms of the longevity, and in terms of the stability. Because what was very interesting is when Europe was on its great movement towards utopia with the Enlightenment, the idea that we human beings were going to create a much better world. And we were dynamic, and we'd given our soul to the machine. At that moment, when we looked at the Islamic world, We saw it as being stagnant. It wasn't stagnant, it was stable. The whole Mizan principle works on the basis of dynamic equilibrium. The center in Islam is so powerful, as we all know as Muslims, that when you go away from the center, there's always that draw back to the center. The criteria were all so clear in Islam that when things went bad, the good was always there for it to be able to go back to. Because there will always be the dynamic. We are living as human beings with all the possibility of going from being angels to being devils. And Islam manifested a world in which that whole drama could take place. So there is no comparison between a world that spread from West Africa to China, that engaged all the different cultures and languages and worlds and tribes, and the transformation of the Roman Empire into Christendom. I wanted just to say one thing, and that is that people often ask me, why was there no drama? Why was there no theatre in Islam? Because there wasn't. They didn't take the theatre from the Greeks, they didn't take the theatre. There's a very good reason for that. That is because life is the theatre. This is the drama. This is the drama. And the Muslims were living the drama because Islam is all about the way of life. And a way of life that could embody the whole nature of the human. From the highest intellect to the simplest of craftsmen. They were all a part of the same drama. The way of life. That's what was established across Dar al-Islam. That was what was maintained. And that was what reached its highest point in all the different aspects. Hassan Spiker has done remarkable work on the whole question of the reasoning mind. This is a very important part of the thesis. Because the reasoning mind in Islam reached its highest point in the knowledge of God. In Christendom, it was banished from the religion by Luther and went into the material realm. Deeper and deeper into the phonic realm. You must read my book, it's quite good. And by the way, it's good because of this book. And this book is Life's Journey, the story behind a book. I had to write this book in order to explain how this book came into existence. Because that book came into existence because of the people I met, the situations I was placed in, the understandings I was given, and the men of wisdom that I have encountered in my life. And I was able to just put it together in this. So I had to write a longer book for the references to explain this book. I'm not a bad salesman. My wife is always telling me, you've got to sell the books.
I guess we take one more question. Yes, from the middle here.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I'm really interested in your relationship with art, particularly theatre. As you described theatre to be this world. But I'd like to know how you feel about theatre now, since becoming Muslim, and how your relationship with art has changed.
We'll have to make it quite short as well.
Yeah. I have to say to you, I love the wonderful language of performers. I love to listen to some of them. They're so good. My wife and I, we listen to audiobooks. And you get the most wonderful people being able to read, who read these, who aren't actors, they're trained. And I think one of the greatest sadnesses with the education system is that we do not teach rhetoric. We don't teach people how to speak. And after all, the thing we do more than anything else in our lives, practically, apart from breathing. And yet we don't know how to speak. So I think that what I love about Muslim communities is they love talking. And that's why I say the drama. The drama's in the family, the drama, I see drama as our way, as life, because in life we play many, many different roles. I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, I'm a son, I'm talking with you, I then sit with some of these great scholars like a student, and as I am a student, etc., etc. So we're always playing roles. So I think the drama, the lovely thing about the drama is it teaches you to be able to enjoy those roles, to get the best out of them, to play them well. And that's good. And I do love theatre, good theatre. But I haven't been to one for a very, very long time. I mean, for many years. But I think this is, it's in the time we're living in now. They're so visually taken over. But we could go on talking about this for a long time.
Thank you. As you can probably tell already, this event is in collaboration with the Cambridge University Islamic Society. So that concludes Explore Islam Week, which has been going on for most of this week. You can learn more about the Cambridge University Islamic Society through this big banner, if you scan the QR code as well. I'd like to also thank the Cambridge Union Committee as well, SAD as well, for accommodating for this event and making this collaboration possible. But before we could, I'd like to thank Ahmed Keeler as well for your time, for your insightful remarks, and really appreciate you speaking to us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.